Our next segment of this evening is a conversation between our two panels. So on my immediate right, we've got a panel that has been around in their careers for a lot longer than the panel who's further on the left, who are much earlier in their careers. And so I'd like to open it up for discussion between the two of them. And I'm wondering whether you folks here on my immediate right, our established panel, have got any comments, questions, or tools that you might like to offer Robin and her colleagues. Lorna.
Well, first of all, thank you all. It was just really fascinating. My own experience is that I was hired at the University of Toronto in 1972 as a faculty member, and I thought this was wonderful. The longer you stay, the more obvious the bias and discrimination becomes. So it's not over yet. And I entirely agree with...
Tools help.
Tools help. Exactly. But I certainly agree with you that if our generation can do something about tools, well, we should do it. And my own experience is that if you go to the people who've been around for a long time, you may find some of them. A lot of people have just kept quiet about it, but that doesn't mean they won't help you.
Anybody else want to offer up comments?
All I would say is that sometimes you have to pick your battles. You have to really figure out what your sphere of influence is, what you can change, how hard you can push. If you're a junior faculty member trying to influence the behavior of your older faculty members or more senior or whatever, you have to really decide how much you're going to risk in doing that. And a really easy strategy is bring someone in from outside. Bring in a, visiting distinguished somebody or other to talk about some of these issues in a very practical way, because very often if it comes from outside, people will hear it. So I think that's one of the things. Certainly at the Diversity Institute, we do a lot of work, and most universities have pockets that talk about bias-free hiring and bias-free teaching, because one of the what's interesting to me, because I started looking at gender issues very early on. It was after the Montreal massacre. Actually, there was a December 6th committee was set up, and one of the things they took on was women in engineering, and they wanted to do, it was after more than just numbers, they wanted to do equity training for all the first-year engineers. And the head of harassment services at Ryerson said, "I'm not going in there. I am not going in there." They said, "Give it to Wendy, she'll do anything." So that's how I became a gender expert. It was because I had a lot of experience going into rooms full of men with guns, and they figured that was good training for going in to talk to the engineers. But the reality is that there are a lot of ways you can get at some of the issues around FaceTime, which is a huge issue. As a female executive, it's a huge issue. It's been an issue all the way up. If you look at, in fact, when I did a session on diversity for my executive at my university, I just said, look at your calendars and do an analysis of who you're meeting with. And my bet is you're meeting primarily, because you are, middle-aged or older white men, very few women, and very few racialized people. What does that tell you about where your priorities are in a city? And remember, this is in Toronto, right? Toronto's a quarter white men, quarter white women, quarter racialized men, quarter racialized women, half the population born outside. So if your Rolodex and if your agenda is full of people who look exactly like you, there's an issue. When it comes to the classroom stuff, you can frame similar kinds of tools and self-assessment. One of the big challenges, for example, in a typical classroom is if you say, what is the answer to X, Y, Z, right? Generally, apologies to the white men in the room, but in general, that's the segment of the population that will dominate. Women will be sitting there saying, I know that, I don't want to be embarrassed. And many ethnic groups put a priority on sort of deference and humility. They're not the ones sitting there going like this. Really simple strategy is, instead of saying, does anyone know the answer to this question, you go around the room, you share space. Same thing in meetings. We did focus groups across the country with women in technology, and the number of women who said the same thing, which was, I'm in a meeting, I never get a chance to talk. When I talk, I can say something, I'm ignored. A guy says exactly the same thing 5 minutes later, and everyone goes, oh, genius, what a great idea. So, I mean, and that is an experience that women across the country report over and over and over again. And the same thing is, the same dynamics play out in our classrooms. So there's lots of really sort of simple, good pedagogy that actually gets at some of those issues around bias, and pulling in some of the experts around teaching and learning who are not you, but are going to deliver the message, may be one of the ways to go.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Okay, I'm going to ask our panel, our emerging scientific panel, to ask whatever it is you'd like to ask our established panel.
Just continuing on the bias sort of avenue still, I'm wondering how we, there are issues with propagation. So although there's bias issues that we've set up for ourselves, there's a lot of documentation on how women also propagate this to other women. And we have a few examples of this, and I've seen it at my job at OBI in a couple of instances where there was panels of women, and the majority of the panel was women, but the selected scientists, they were a lot harder on the women who were sort of trying out, let's say. But also, I was talking to some of my colleagues, and there was another example where the women who were reviewing the applications were a lot harder on everybody. Their comments were a lot sharper and harder on not just the women, but also the men. So I'm wondering, how do we sort of change our mindsets about that?
Hey, Diane, do you want to take that one?
I think that this is an issue, and certainly the data on gender schema, gender bias suggests that both men and women have these issues. And so in one way, to also touch on something, another comment, that is one way of diffusing the issue, because it is an issue for both men and women. So gender bias is not something that just comes from men and is directed at women. That's one part of the answer, I think, that it's true that it comes from women too. People need to know that exists. And women, especially women who are now in positions of authority, need to recognize that they may have those issues. So education is as important for them as it is for men in those positions. The other maybe dynamic there is that in some cases, women who are currently in senior positions got there partly because they had to adopt a particular mode of interaction in a climate in the past that didn't allow for more sort of less harsh judgments or less harsh ways of interacting with their colleagues. And so some of that will be hard to change, because either people succeeded because they had personalities that were like that, and that was a mode that was acceptable then, or that was necessary then, or they adopted it along the way. But I think, again, education is the bottom line. If you're equally harsh to men and women, it's not so much of an issue. You're just a harsh person, and you're challenging to get past in terms of review. But if you do have biases, you need to be informed that you have those biases. And actually, there's some good studies with respect to, at least to racial bias, unconscious biases, that suggest that once you're educated about the nature of your bias, accepting those who are just virulent racists or sexists, which most of us are not, you can change your behavior, and that you will be vigilant to the aspects of your behavior that are biased. So again, I just emphasize that I think education is essential. One kind of fun and easy way to do it is to try to start banding around this implicit associations test out of Harvard. There's some pretty good data that suggests that it's a good indicator of unconscious biases. You'll find that people debate the quality of the tests. I did a panel discussion on unconscious racial biases and did the test as part of that, and have discovered that I'm biased against blacks and in favor of whites, moderately so. And so it's very disturbing. But I advise people to try it, and that's one way that people can start thinking about this.
Can I ask a follow-up question to
Yes,
that one?
go ahead.
So one of the things I worry about is that the perception that people will see, I have a female scientist friend who's a few years ahead of me, and she's a tough nut. She's a really tough nut. And I like that about her, actually, and I admire it. And I worry about the perception, though, being maybe not so much she's harder on people. She's as hard on everyone. But the perception backwards, people looking up, perceive her as being more difficult to work with or more challenging or mean, because the perception, especially because, and she perceived it as both being a gender thing and because of her ethnicity, is people have this assumption that she would be a nurturer, and she's not. And, I hear what you're saying, but I also worry about pigeonholing us into being, these gentle mothering figures, when in fact sometimes we're pit bulls and we should be encouraged to be pit bulls. And we need the whole range of female experiences, not just people who are selected because they fall into that, really harsh, I had to claw my way to the top, and so everyone else is going to be shot down the way I was. But we also need not to push forward these, and I have a hard time because I am a huge nurturer, but, we don't want to actually, encourage women to follow that pathway either. We need to allow them the space to be aggressive and
Okay, I'm just going to do a time check here. We've got 5 minutes left in this segment, so I'm going to ask Wendy to respond briefly, and then Lorna.
I would just say women are always held to a higher standard of likability, and that comes through with politicians particularly, but you see it with professors, even at the University of Toronto. Female faculty are always judged more harshly in student evaluations, and surveys even today say the average woman would rather work for a man. So those issues are very deeply ingrained, and we really have to fight against them.
Lorna?
And I would say numbers count. Those studies done so many years ago that show that if there's one woman, she keeps quiet. If there are two, but after three and more, then you can have a diversity of personalities. So quite frankly, one strategy is not to agree to join any committee where you are the only one or there are only two, because it very quickly goes away after a certain number.
Yeah, I think the critical mass that I've seen is 30%. Robin, before we conclude this segment, is there something that you would like to ask this panel?
Actually, I'd like to ask Dr. Marsden, from the report, so was there a conclusion by the government that there was bias in the, I've seen so many comments saying that there was a review of whether or not there was gender bias in the Canada Excellence Research Chairs, and I actually contacted the Canada Research Chairs to talk to them about gender bias at the beginning of the hirings, and they wrote back and said, we're getting much better. We've started making sure that there's an increasing number of women who are hired every year. And look at, here are the names of 3 women who are, and I actually wrote to them and said that it appears that about 25% of these chairs are held by women, but over 50% of the photos on your website are of women. So it looks like you're trying to be something that you're not necessarily. It's like greenwashing in packaging. Has the government admitted, like I've seen that people have spoke out, there was a review, but I haven't seen anyone take
The government hasn't responded to our report.
Okay.
But the mere fact that the officials in Industry Canada said we need to know a lot more about these barriers, I think is helpful. So that means there's real curiosity, not simply a political response. And we'll see where it goes. So far,